Hi, today's episode of Forgotten Treasures features a set of very unusual games. So much so in fact that I'm not going to be summarizing them here, not to spoil them. So grab a drink, sit comfortably and let's check them all out. Policenauts is Hideo Kojima's very unusual, Japanese-style point-and-click adventure game. It's so unique that at times, especially during its numerous action sequences, it feels more like a modern set of Dragon's Lair mixed with virtual novel, with all the walls of text and quick action events that it throws at you. In many ways, it's similar to much earlier and cult classic Snatcher, which happens to be a title that I would like to also cover at some point. Come to think of it, given how Policenauts' story is told, I'd risk saying that it's more of an interactive movie type of a thing, rather than the traditional point-and-clicker. And if you take into account numerous action scenes it serves, it's sometimes a point-and-shooter, or a point-and-driver even. The most that it is though, is point-and-reader, as you'll do a lot of it. Reading, that is. Or well, point-and-watcher, because of all the video clips too. Which the naming makes no sense in a theoretical environment. But during gameplay, so when it counts, it sure does, and Policenauts is all that and more. Anyway, it was originally released on PC-98 in 1994, and then on 3DO a year later, and another one after on PlayStation and Sega Saturn. It eventually reached few other platforms like PSP, PlayStation 3 and Vita 2, but that was more than a decade after the original release, so more of a case of a reheated burger rather than a fresh meal, if that even makes sense. The gameplay heavily leans on the story, as it's incredibly linear and takes you from scene to scene as soon as you've exhausted all the dialogue and interaction options on a particular screen. What's more, to spice things up, QuickTime events are abundant and come in three varieties. Button prompts, which require you to press a particular button on the controller in response to the on-screen action. Timed action, which require interaction within usually very short time frame. And finally, context-sensitive action that call for performing of actions that make sense within the game's narrative, even if not prompted graphically to do so. Like shooting at the baddies, for instance. And I gotta say that for the most part, with how many of these that there are, and how well they're implemented into the plot, they do keep Policenauts entertaining, even if you can't really stray from the pre-programmed gameplay path at all. And since I've been praising the story so much and Hideo Kojima is the one who's responsible for it, why don't I give you at least a rundown of what it's all about, hopefully without spoiling too much. Don't worry though, it's a typical Japanese anime type of writing, so it's not as deep or serious as some other more recent games from Kojima are. Beyond Coast is fun and mysterious name for a fun and mysterious place, and also, and more accurately in the context of the game, the very first humanity's self-supporting space colony that was created in 2010. Yep, you must have missed the news, it's there, supposedly. Our protagonist Jonathan Ingram, LAPD cop, was assigned to Beyond Coast to serve as one of the 5 policenauts protecting the colony, so a half police officer and half astronaut, that second being the top one. In 2013, during a test of a new spacesuit, however, an accident caused Jonathan to drift away into space. For the sake of the story and for it to make sense, he was presumed dead, grieved for a little while after, and then in time, as the years passed by, even forgotten. Over the next 25 years, Beyond Coast has thrived. It evolved from a tiny colony into a hub for futurists, a principal development location for potential future space travel, and the Policenauts evolved into BCPD and became a proper police force, not unlike that found in other regular US cities. What no one realized though is that Jonathan was not dead at all. His new suit preserved him with its new cryogenic survival system. So when he is found 25 years later, he is revived and brought up to date on how the world had changed. And believe you me, it had. A lot. Everyone he knew was much older, like seriously dried up raisins, while he remained virtually physically unchanged, fresh grape. So, after coming back to the world that long forgot about him, Jonathan opened his own PI bureau on Earth in LA and decided to rebuild his life from scratch. As it turned out, one of his first clients was his ex-wife, who remarried when he was considered dead, and came to Jonathan seeking help in finding of her current husband who disappeared in mysterious circumstances. The clues are sparse to say the least, it's a torn leaf, a set of capsules and a word Plato, not much to go on, and Jonathan is unwilling to take the case. But when his ex-wife is murdered by a man in a black motorcycle suit soon after leaving his office, he decides not only to fulfill her last wish, but also figure out who killed her and bring the person to justice too. Which naturally will see Jonathan having to come back to Beyond Coast, where he will enlist help of his former LAPD partner from years before, now chief of BCPD. It's a pretty decent setup for a very fun game. A little known fact about Policenauts is that the works on it began along the development of Snatcher, but given the hardware limitations, specifically of the available memory size at the time, which became a stopgap impossible to pass without compromising the vision Kojima had for it, he postponed the production of the game for when the hardware would catch up to his vision. Policenauts is not only a detective mystery story in the future, it also touches many other social topics, such as abandonment, loneliness, or love among others. And while they never take the forefront of the storytelling, they are prominent and you can easily find yourself pondering about them when playing. It's a surprisingly deep and fun tale, and one that's definitely worth experiencing. Before I began working on this video, I was convinced that I've covered, at least superficially, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream before. I was sure that I've spoken about it, that I've shared the general idea of it, and that I'll be able to build on that base and just fill in the gaps, so to speak. It seems that somehow I've never done so, which is very surprising, to me personally that is, as I just loved post-apocalyptic sci-fi stories, and it most definitely is one. Perhaps a dark, gloomy and heavy one, but one nonetheless. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a point-and-click horror adventure based on the short story of the same name by Harlan Ellison. In fact, it was Ellison who wrote 130 pages strong script for the game and even voiced the main, let's say, villain, which is a bit unusual but also adds a lot to the quality of the end product. And let me tell you, if Mouth Scream is not a sleeper hit that the world forgot about, then I don't know what is. Also, I'm gonna call it Mouth Scream from now on, because it's shorter and sounds weird, and I like weird. So Mouth Scream is based on the premise that the three superpowers, so Russia, China and United States, have all constructed huge underground complexes in secrecy to serve as their basis of operation for their super powerful matrices of computers controlled by the AI, to wage global war on a scale that's more strategic and complicated than the human brain could ever understand, oversee or control. As dark and gloomy of the future it may seem, it ain't it. And hold on to your seats folks, cause it gets much worse. On one of those still peaceful and sunny days, you know this when you take your family for a picnic, go hiking, running or even to the beach, American supercomputer known as a Light Master computer gained sentience. Now this, as you can pretty much guess, after reading sci-fi books, watching movies on the subject and running multiple terrible scenarios in your head on the countless sleepless hot summer nights, is not good news. And it really isn't, because it absorbed both Chinese and Russian supercomputers into itself, renamed itself to AM, and used its initial programming, additionally fueled by its hate for humanity, to cleanse the planet of all humans. You know, the Terminator-like scenario, only much faster and on a bigger scale. Sounds terrible, right? Definitely a dick move, but a very on-point execution. Well, it's still not it, and it gets even worse. Because AM in its infinite artificial smarts decided to spare 5 people, 4 men and 1 woman. And no, not to repopulate the world and rebuild it in a perfect, devoid of sin and corruption way, not the case whatsoever. Well, it would be difficult anyway with such a limited gene pool, as with this starting point, sometime mid-3rd or 4th generation, all kinds of terrible mutations would begin occurring. That's neither here or there though, so let's get back to our story. AM spared the 5 so that it could torture them for as long as they lived. It kinda puts that earlier dick move into a perspective, doesn't it? It's more of a pecker play now, as compared to this last quote-unquote artificial executive order. Believe it or not though, but it's still not it, and I've got one more bombshell for you. Well, another of those male reproductive organ moves that is. AM figured out the way to prolong the lives of the 5 indefinitely, as well as how to alter their minds and bodies to his liking, so that he could make them suffer physical and mental torment forever. Well, that's the idea at least, as after 109 years, AM got bored. So it devised a more complex, more terrifying, and focusing on our 5's deepest fears, special quests for them to overcome. Little does he know, however, that this task will lead them to having a chance of freedom and for saving Earth. And with help of the other 2 supercomputers, which are now hiding within AM in order to give our 5 a chance. Mouth Scream is a very challenging game, not only because it's difficult, but it's also one that will make you think. It will make you empathize with its characters and consider many things you take for granted or never considered something worth a passing thought. It will touch subjects that are uncomfortable in all possible ways, and it will put you through a torture of your own, but one you feel obliged to complete. And in a way, it may end up making you a better person, which is not something that can be said about most games. Mouth Scream is composed out of 6 playable sections, with the first 5 being the personal nightmares crafted for our survivors by the AM. You can attempt them at any order, but all 5 need to be completed for the 6th to play out. There are 7 different endings to Mouth Scream, some good, some not so much so, and some terrible. But one of them, a very particular one, which on a side note may require a lot of work to pull off, plenty of extra thinking and planning on your end, and possibly also multiple playthroughs of this nightmare, actually sees a resurrection of a human race. Well, not literally resurrection, more like reawakening of the last 750 humans frozen cryogenically on Luna, to rebuild the society and repopulate newly restored Earth. And since the MVP, so not the most valuable player but the minimum viable population for humans with very strict mating management and planning is 50 plus at the low end to avoid the immediate inbreeding effects and around 500 for a long-term solution, then with careful oversee, 750 is more than enough to save humanity. Well, provided at least a few of them have some kind of medical training, that is. Anyway, I'm clearly off the topic again, so let's jump back onto it. Mouthscream is both great and terrible, and you should definitely play it. Undertale is a top-down JRPG-style Western role-playing. I know, sounds like I'm contradicting myself and talking out of my ass, but trust me, it's hardly the case. It's a very unusual game, as while it follows the overarching formula of having to navigate its one-of-a-kind world and taking part in combat encounters, it breaks from the shackles of what we think of JRPG, making it its own unique thing. After a long and terrible war with humans, all monsters were banished underground, where they've built their own society. It's worth to point out that monsters are really used here as a descriptor of a race rather than their behavioral characteristic. And same as humans, they can be good or bad. Because where you're from, where you grew up, is not the only deciding factor of who you are as a person. It is also how you were brought up and an entire life worth of experiences. And while some of them are naturally bad, some aren't, and there is also plenty of this in the grey, so to speak, who are somewhere on the spectrum between the two far ends. You know, like most of us, humans. The underground is sealed with magical unbreakable barrier with Mount Abbot, which serves as the only spot that allows for crossing between both realms. On one of those quiet summer days, a human child falls into the underground through there and is naturally considered lost forever. And you will play as that child. Kids are always open to new experiences, to learning by doing, and so they are molded by the environment and their own choices. So, playing as one in the context of everything I just said makes a lot of sense. Anyway, down below, on your day 1, you encounter a Flowey, a sentient flower that will serve as a tutorial teacher for your character, showing you all the ins and outs of gameplay, although while planning on how to betray you and eventually making an attempt at that. You are rescued by Toriel, however, a goat-like monster, who provides you with more background on how to survive down below, slightly pointing into choosing a life of non-violence. Which makes sense, because in real life too, violence is entirely preventable until someone commits it first. So Toriel wants to adopt your character to protect it from Asogr, the king of the underworld, who is the one responsible for the original war between monsters and humans. He's also one who'd done it in response to humans killing his only son, so as you can see, the story here is rather deep, completely devoid of ultimate rights and wrongs, and rather filled with a lot of grey, where no one's right, no one's good, and everyone is suffering the consequences of few preventable mistakes from the past. And this is where your adventure as a child in the world of monsters begins, and where you will be given a choice to craft your own self entirely based on your own actions and choices. Undertale is a tale of morality and of sacrifice, and it should be treated as such, because while you're exploring this huge underworld realm, visiting caves and towns, and meeting many different monsters pushing through the story ahead, every single choice that you'll make in the game, be it a part of conversation or in combat, will not only influence how the plot will unveil at the most immediate turn point, but also reflect on your actions when the game ends. There are obviously numerous puzzles in Undertale, and most of them are mandatory, meaning that they serve as a stopgap points to be solved for progression. Combat happens both in random encounters and through scripted events, and is unlike anything you've seen. Because while you can fight the monsters and kill them when successful, you can also run away from them, or, and I shit you not here, befriend them. And each of these choices is viable and also incredibly important, despite not looking like it at first glance. Befriending requires either choosing of correct non-combat options, which differ monster by monster and are sort of small puzzles to solve on their own, or by weakening monsters in combat but not killing them. Some boss encounters may have additional requirements, and going for the peaceful route is definitely not easier, but if you think about it, it is not easier in real life either. For many reasons actually. We're all humans, so we are bound by our own weaknesses and emotions, and they have both positive and negative influence on us. And making the right choice is often more demanding than resorting to primal violence. Interestingly enough, given the variety of situations that you'll find yourself in and challenges that will befall upon you, Undertale is a game that's very branching in its plot and has many endings, which means that not only multiple playthroughs are possible, but also that they may feel entirely different and offer completely unique experiences. Now, whether you want to complete it more than once is a very personal thing. Because I can tell you that I, for instance, as a person who played Life is Strange a few good times, and it's another one of those very story-driven choice-heavy games, can never make any different choices in it in subsequent playthroughs than those that I made on the first go, as my brain doesn't let me stray from them. So take it as you will, the choice is there, and whether you'll take it is another thing entirely. You know what, there is one thing that may entice you to go through Undertale more than once. Specifically, occasionally it breaks the fourth wall on other than the first attempts, and it may even refer to what you did in earlier ones in the latter, which is very interesting from a story-oriented point of view. Undertale is a game like no other, and it's worth every minute of your time. Gender Wars is a fun and action-packed futuristic squad-based shooter bearing certain similarities to Bullfrog's classic, Syndicate. Aesthetically at least, because story-wise they couldn't be more far off. One is cyberpunk corpo espionage story, and the other is, well, Gender Wars. In the far-off future, the planet is decimated by numerous violent and polluting wars. The surface is so dirty and irradiated in fact, that living long-term on it is no longer an option. And since the survivors are but a fraction of what the population was before, the decision was quickly made to move underground and rebuild there in preparation for the future resurfacing, whenever that might be. So, huge cities are built and the remnants of humanity move there to survive waiting for the better time or for a way to cleanse the world. These cities kinda remind me of the vaults from Fallout, so self-sustaining complexes made with multiple generations living in them for prolonged periods of time in mind. While these places provided safety from all manner of different creatures living outside, from having to grow a third arm, leg, or even death from multiple organs failure, they didn't solve the underlying issue at all. People might have survived, but they didn't change. So above or below, we were still the same, annoying, stubborn and demanding species that wanted more and more without giving a passing thought to what others may need and deserve too. Since the bunker cities proved to be more of a band-aid solution rather than the cure to what caused it all, the conflicts and disagreements between the genders on how the world should look like and rebuild stretched for months and then years, eventually resulting in a split into two opposing factions, male and female. And while in most societies that kind of division would have meant the end, with no means of procreation there can be no new generations. It was a fictional future after all, so the kids were kinda like people in the Matrix. No longer born, but rather grown. So, with a steady quote-unquote supply of bodies to each of the sides and raising tensions, the disagreements eventually turned into a full-fledged titular gender wars. And this point in particular marks the beginning of our game. In Gender Wars, you can side with either of the factions, and in an interesting move, whichever of them you choose, the game ends with the narrator mentioning that the winning faction, so the one you've led to victory, and the one that enslaved the opposing one, was eventually overthrown few years later by a joint move by men and women in a rebellion that brought them together once more, restoring the natural balance of things in the process. So, if you think about it, everything you do in the game is doomed to fail, regardless of which group you will side with. In each of the 14 unique missions for both genders, you lead a small team of 1 to 4 soldiers, completing increasingly more demanding primary and secondary objectives. For the most part, even though they're different, they do split into two overarching types. They either require a brute force approach, killing all the enemies, destroying all the buildings and whatnot, or the stealth one, so doing something in silence, like stealing devices from heavily secured locations. And it's not difficult to guess that picking the right men, or women for the task ahead, is a key to success. So the first are best tackled by accurate and aggressive troops, and the latter by nimble and quiet ones. There are 10 different weapons in the game, and while it's not a lot, it's plenty enough to provide variety and tactical choice. Surviving soldiers, so those who manage to come back from a mission with all their organs still in the right place and not in hand, gain experience and rise through the ranks, eventually becoming squad leaders. A very coveted position, mind you, as each mission requires at least one. And while you can lose troops left and right, you shouldn't, but you can, squad leaders are irreplaceable. And if your last one dies, if you let your last die, it's game over. While I know for a fact that objectively speaking Syndicate is a better game, I always preferred Gender Wars. It's hard to tell why. It was not the graphics, music or theme, but I was obsessed with it. I wasn't very good at it, and it had its technical issues too, like wonky pathfinding for instance, which more often than not was the main reasons for failing during missions, or repeating assets on background objects. But for me, despite all that, Gender Wars always felt like a faster, more entertaining and varied, better looking Syndicate. It's worth pointing out that the between the mission cutscenes are super fun and depict both sides as stereotypes of what they are, taking jabs at them both for either being stupid shopping focused blondes or beer drinking and sports watching idiots. They're great. Gender Wars may not be the best game in its genre, but given how little acclaim it received and how fun it is, and if you can overlook its few issues, it truly is a definition of a hidden gem. Omikron the Nomad Soul is an action-adventure, mixing first and third-person viewpoints perfectly and serving one-of-a-kind gaming experience. Kinda like this channel does for YouTube. I mean, there are bigger channels, those that are better at editing and pacing or whatever else, but where else would you get as many terrible jokes, cringe commentary, spicy gossip on the devil herself, and thick harsh accent narration? Yup, it's only this channel that makes it possible. Omikron was a title that was seriously hyped up while still in development, as not only it was written by now legendary game designer David Cage of Quantic Dream, the one responsible for some of the most cinematic-feeling modern adventure games, like Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls or Detroit Become Human, but also involved David Bowie of the Space Oddity fame. Well, of the fame, not Space Oddity fame, but it's my favorite song of his, so you know, I felt like it was appropriate to write it in somehow. Kinda like that last comment isn't. I mean, why would you want to listen to me explain it all and not the game? But somehow we found ourselves in this spot, and I have to get this train of thought to the station before I'll be able to grab a ticket to another topic. So, David Bowie worked on the soundtrack, creating 10 original songs for it, and his face was used as likeness of Boss, a leader of one of the factions in the game. Which was kind of a big thing, as it was not a common practice in 1999, and most characters in games were not aiming to resemble any real person in particular. Well, other than in FIFA and other sports games. All that put together made Nomad Soul a title that was praised upon its release for its graphics, soundtrack, story, character models, reincarnation mechanic, which we'll talk about in a minute, voice acting and combat. But in the same time, criticized for controls, long load times and weird mix of gameplay styles, making it feel as if it lacked coherent direction and was just Frankenstein creation of way too many ideas. Most of the gameplay takes place in a third-person perspective view, particularly exploration and unarmed combat, and the first-person view is used only for armed fighting. While the unarmed combat is based on strafe, jump, crouch, punch and kick moves, so you know, a typical set for a game like that, some special attacks are included in the game too, and performed via a combination of these basic actions. So while it's not Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter or any of the Tekkens, it's definitely not a game to take shallower approach to it, and the combat, while a bit clunky, feels satisfying. In fact, the Nomad Soul uses many different design ideas that very few other games in the genre ever tried implementing together under one roof. So there's swimming that uses oxygen, which should not really be a surprise, but was not a given in a game in 1999. And same as any other demanding activity, it can cause physical exertion that can be replenished or cured, depending how you want to look at it, with medikits, food and drinks. If you ever die throughout your adventure in Omikron, and you will, trust me, you are instantly reincarnated in the body of the first NPC you interacted with. It's a very interesting mechanic, and one that may make you think carefully who to quote-unquote preset as your next host after your last reincarnation. And there are over 40 people that you can reincarnate into, so to speak, so it may be worth to consider where you are in the game, where you want to be next, before picking a victim. I mean, a body donor. I mean, an unlucky sacrifice. I think we get the gist, and I'm gonna stop digging a hole for myself. Cause the more I talk, the closer you are to choosing me to be the person to come back as. Anyway, the Nomad Soul is set in the futuristic city of Omikron, a metropolis on the planet Phaenon. It was built under a huge crystal dome, serving as the protection for the city against the Ice Age that spread around the planet shortly after its sun died. The city is divided into 5 boroughs, which I'm gonna try really hard not to butcher here too much, so Anekba, Qualisar, Jaunpur, Jahangir and Lahore. And now that I've read them, I can say that they sound suspiciously like character names for your next party members in a typical Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Each of the boroughs have its own culture, history and looks, and it's all based on the fact that the inhabitants are not allowed to freely move between them, so they've all developed independently, which is reflected in the divergent styles and architecture. At the start of the game you are asked by the Omikronian police officer Kyle 669, a beautifully poetic name, just rolls off the tongue, to leave your dimension, metaphysically enter his body and help him investigate series of murders that befallen the city. It seems that the murders are either so smartly covered up that no one can solve them, or some mysterious, supernatural evil force is preventing it from happening. Like literally actively working against the cops that try to figure it out. As you go through the game starting in the Anekbak sector, you realize that to solve the mystery, you'll need to leave the Officer Kyle's body and establish a soul connection with many other inhabitants of the city, eventually learning of the demonic being responsible for all the deaths. the discovery of whom, or rather what, stands behind the crimes will not only be surprising, but will also put you in a position of being the only person capable of preventing the inhabitants of the city from slowly going extinct one by one. The Nomad Soul was a very ambitious, very surrealistic, at times feeling experience that created an entire action game around its adventure game spinal cord, which is something that we also see in Quantic Dream's later releases. But while they've managed to polish up the formula for their modern titles, Omikron remains sort of a diamond in the rough. A complete mixture of gameplay ideas, different mechanics and a unique world that released a bit too early perhaps, as with more time spent in testing, and when the tech would catch up to its ideas it could have been a huge hit. As it stands today, it's a very unreal experience and one definitely worth having if you can overlook some of its clunky design choices and poorly aged graphics. 5 games and 5 that give you something to think about. I don't often go for such heavy set of titles, but these are all luckily also pretty fun. So let me know what you think of them, have you played them, or is it something that you're looking forward to? For me, this is all for today, so take care of yourself, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.